The iron poker, still warm from the fire, felt heavier in Eleanor Cairns' hand than the silence pressing against the cottage walls. That silence wasn't empty, though. It was the kind of quiet that listens back, the kind that promised something was coming. Either a ghost or a savior, she couldn't decide which. Outside, the snow had been falling for 6 hours straight. Eleanor pressed her palm against the frozen glass of the single window, wiping away just enough frost to see the world disappear. The path to the village was gone now, swallowed whole by white. Even the old stone marker her grandfather had placed 20 years ago was nothing but a bump in the drifts. December 12th, 1815. She knew the date because it was written on the calendar her grandfather had marked before he passed. The last day he'd ever circled. Now she circled her own days by counting what remained in the cottage. 3 candles left. Half a loaf of bread. A block of cheese the size of a fist. And the poker in her hand, still warm from the last of the firewood she'd allowed herself. Her stomach made a sound she tried to ignore. The cottage had been her grandfather's hunting lodge for 40 years. He'd mapped every ridge and river within 20 miles, filling notebooks with measurements and observations that meant nothing to anyone but him. Now those notebooks sat in a stack by the cold hearth, waiting for someone who would never read them again. Eleanor had come to settle his affairs. That was the plan. A week in the Highlands, then back to the village where she worked as a seamstress. Simple. Ordered. Safe. The snow had other ideas. She ran her fingers along the edge of the windowsill, feeling the tiny draft that snaked through where the wood had warped with age. Her grandfather had always meant to fix that. He'd said so every winter for 10 years. Some promises, she was learning, never made it past intention. The bread on the table caught her eye. Half a heel, dark and dense, the kind that filled your stomach slow and kept you going. She'd been rationing it for 3 days now, cutting thinner slices each morning, telling herself the storm would break tomorrow. Tomorrow kept not coming. She touched her pocket, feeling the small leather pouch inside. 23 shillings. All the money she had in the world. Not enough to buy passage anywhere, barely enough to restock supplies when, if, she made it back to civilization. The wind picked up outside, a low moan that found every crack in the cottage walls. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and moved closer to the fire. The flames danced low and blue, hungry for what she couldn't spare. She thought about her father then. The way he'd talk about this cottage like it was a prison, not a refuge. The way he'd left one winter and never came back, leaving her with grandparents who loved her but couldn't quite hide their disappointment in where she'd come from. That was 10 years ago. She'd been 15. Now 25, alone in the Highlands, waiting for snow to decide her fate. The poker tapped against the stone hearth, a nervous rhythm she didn't realize she was making until she caught herself. She set it down, then picked it right back up. The weight was comforting. Solid. Real in a way that promises weren't. Outside, the world had gone completely white. No horizon, no sky, just endless falling flakes that blurred everything together until there was no up or down, only snow. She calculated quickly in her head. For more days of provisions if she stretched. 5 if she got desperate. But the cold was the real enemy. Without enough wood, the cottage would become an icebox by the 3rd night. She'd seen it happen to animals caught in storms. The way they'd curl up tight, looking almost peaceful, right before they stopped moving altogether. No, she wouldn't think like that. Her grandfather had survived 40 winters in this cottage. He'd taught her how to read weather in cloud formations, how to find direction without a compass, how to stay calm when the world went quiet and white. Those lessons were still inside her somewhere, buried under grief and fear. She just had to remember. The afternoon crawled by. Eleanor busied herself with small tasks, reorganizing the food stores, counting candles again as if they'd multiply, reading passages from her grandfather's journals just to hear a voice in the room, even if it was only in her head. His handwriting was terrible, looping and cramped, with notes in the margins that made sense only to him. But between the measurements and observations, she found pieces of the man he'd been. Small things. A mention of her grandmother's favorite flower. A note about the first time he'd held Eleanor as a baby. The price of tea in the village, recorded like it mattered, because to him, it did. She was reading one of these entries when she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, the way it could sound like voices if you listened too long. But this was different. This was rhythm. Intent. Footsteps. Running. Then pounding. Heavy and desperate against the chipped blue door, rattling the iron hinges hard enough to shake snow from the frame above. Eleanor froze. The poker was in her hand before she made the conscious choice to grab it. No one travelled in weather like this. No one. The pass was closed, the village cut off, the nearest farm 3 miles through terrain that would swallow a man whole in these conditions. The pounding came again. Harder. And then she heard it. Breathing. Ragged and wet, pressed against the wood on the other side. A man's voice, too winded to form words, just gasping for air like he'd been running from something worse than the cold. Then the sound that made her blood run cold despite the fire. Metal. The distinct clink of a spurred boot scraping against the stone threshold. Someone with money. Someone with horses. Someone who had no business being anywhere near this remote corner of the Highlands in the middle of a blizzard. The pounding stopped. For one terrible moment, there was only the wind. Then the voice came through the door, desperate and raw, barely loud enough to hear over the storm. Open it, or I freeze. Her fingers found the latch before her mind caught up with what she was doing. The iron was so cold it burned, and for a terrifying second, it stuck fast. Eleanor pulled harder, using both hands, the poker balanced awkwardly under her arm. The door burst open. Wind and snow exploded into the cottage like something alive. Candles flickered and died. Papers flew from the table. The cold hit her cheeks so hard it felt like sand, forcing her eyes to squeeze shut. When she opened them, he was already falling. A man in a dark velvet coat crashed through the doorway, his weight slamming into her shoulder. Eleanor stumbled backward, grabbing at his arms to keep them both from hitting the stone floor. The fabric of his sleeve was frozen stiff, not damp, not wet, but frozen solid, like ice-coated laundry left out too long. He was shaking. Not shivering, but shaking. Deep, violent tremors that started somewhere in his core and rattled through his entire body. She could feel it in her own bones just holding him. The door banged against its frame. Snow kept blowing in, dusting the floor with white that melted instantly on the warm stones near the hearth. Eleanor kicked the door shut. The sound echoed through the cottage like a gunshot. Then there was only the man's ragged breathing and the snap of the fire. She lowered him to the floor, half carrying, half dragging his weight across the room. He was tall, she could tell even like this, and heavy in that solid way men got when they'd never missed a meal. Her arms burned with the effort. Up close, she could smell him. Frost, mostly. And horse sweat, dried and frozen and thawing now in the warmth. Leather. Something else underneath. Something expensive. Sandalwood, maybe. The kind of scent that came from shops she'd only ever passed on the outside looking in. His lips were blue. Not pale, not purple, but blue. The color of winter sky just before dark. Eleanor's training kicked in before the fear could catch up. Her grandmother had taught her this. Get them warm. Slow. Too fast and the shock would kill them anyway. She grabbed the blanket from her cot, her only blanket, and wrapped it around his shoulders. His coat was frozen solid, but taking it off now would only make things worse. She piled more wood on the fire, too much wood, which she'd been saving, which she couldn't spare. Didn't matter. None of it mattered if he died on her floor. His eyes were closed, but his chest moved. Shallow, quick breaths that didn't seem to be doing enough. She tilted his head back slightly, the way she'd seen done for a man who'd nearly drowned in the village pond when she was a girl. Stay with me, she whispered. Stay with me, whoever you are. His hand moved. Just a twitch, but it was something. She grabbed it without thinking, holding tight. His fingers were ice, even through the glove. The glove. Fine leather, soft as butter, with buttons so small she couldn't imagine how anyone fastened them. A lord's hands. A lord's coat. a lurid scent clinging to fabric that had no business being anywhere near this cottage. Who was he? The whiskey. Her grandfather's last bottle, hidden at the back of the cupboard for emergencies. She'd promised herself she wouldn't touch it until she was safely back in the village, until all of this was just a memory to tell over tea. Emergencies. This qualified. Eleanor let go of his hand and scrambled to the cupboard. Her fingers found the bottle by feel, thick glass, amber liquid catching the firelight. The seal was still intact. Her grandfather had been saving it for something special. Something that never came. She broke the seal. Back at his side, she lifted his head carefully, cradling it in her palm. His skin was too cold. Like touching something that belonged in the ground, not above it. "Drink," she said. "You have to drink." The whiskey touched his lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his throat moved. A swallow. Another. His whole body convulsed as the warmth hit his stomach, and he coughed violently, eyes still closed. She kept going. Small sips, letting the whiskey do what fire couldn't yet. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the only sounds were his breathing and the crackle of flames and the soft slosh of liquid in the bottle. After what felt like forever, the shaking started to change. Still violent, but different now. Warmer. His body was fighting back. Eleanor set the bottle aside and looked at him properly for the first time. Young. That was her first thought. Younger than she'd expected, maybe 30 at most. Dark hair plastered to his forehead by melted snow. Cheekbones that could cut glass, the kind that came from generations of good food and better breeding. A scar on his chin, small and white, old enough to be part of him now. His clothes told a story she couldn't quite read. Fine materials, expensive cut, but worn hard. Dirt on his boots that wasn't from today. A tear in his coat sleeve that had been mended, badly, by someone who didn't know what they were doing. Who was he? What was he doing here? The questions would have to wait. For now, she just needed him alive. She checked his hands and feet carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her. No frostbite yet, but close. So close. Another hour in that storm and he'd have lost fingers. Maybe more. The fire popped, sending sparks onto the stone. Eleanor watched them die, then looked back at her unexpected guest. His lips weren't blue anymore. Pale, yes. Tired, yes. But pink again. Human again. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The whiskey bottle sat between them, half empty. Her grandfather's last gift, poured into a stranger. She thought about the bread, about the candles, about all the careful rationing she'd done to stretch her supplies. All thrown aside in 10 minutes because a man had pounded on her door. Was she foolish? Maybe. But her grandmother had always said there were two kinds of people in this world, those who closed the door and those who opened it. Eleanor knew which one she wanted to be. The man stirred. His eyes didn't open, but his lips moved. Words, too soft to hear at first. She leaned closer. Map. He muttered. Have to find it. The old man's map. Eleanor's blood went cold. Old man. Map. There was only one old man who'd lived here, only one mapmaker within 50 miles. Her grandfather. He wasn't just lost. He wasn't just desperate. He'd come here on purpose. He'd been looking for this cottage, for something inside it, something her grandfather had made. She looked at the poker, still lying where she dropped it near the hearth. Then back at the man, helpless and shivering in her blanket. You knew him, she said quietly. No response. Just the muttering, the twitching of dreams she couldn't see. Alern picked up the poker. The weight was different now. Heavier. More complicated. You used him, she whispered. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And in her cottage, in the middle of a storm that had trapped them both, Eleanor sat holding a weapon, watching a stranger sleep, wondering if she'd just saved her enemy. Morning light crept through the single window, pale and weak against the snow piled halfway up the glass. Eleanor had been watching it for hours, her back against the wall, the poker cold in her lap now that the fire had died to embers. The man slept. His breathing had evened out sometime around midnight, shifting from desperate gasps to something almost peaceful. She'd checked on him every hour, telling herself it was just to make sure he didn't die. Telling herself a lot of things. The cottage felt different now. Smaller. The walls that had protected her for days now felt like they were closing in, holding secrets she hadn't known were hiding in plain sight. Her grandfather's journals sat in their stack by the cold hearth. She'd read them a dozen times over the past week, looking for comfort, looking for pieces of him she could carry forward. But she hadn't been looking for maps. Hadn't been looking for whatever secret was important enough to send a lord into a blizzard. The man shifted, groaned softly. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. Eleanor watched him and thought about her father. She'd been 15 when he left. Old enough to remember everything, young enough to believe it was a fault somehow. The way he'd stood in this very cottage, yelling at her grandfather about money, about debts, about being trapped in a life that wasn't big enough for him. Her grandfather had been calm through it all. That's what she remembered most. The way he'd just stood there, pipe in hand, letting her father scream until there was nothing left. The taxes are too high, her father had said. That landlord is bleeding us dry. It's not my fault. Her grandfather had nodded. Said nothing. Now, 10 years later, a lord lay on her floor, muttering about maps and old men and secrets. And Eleanor wondered how much of her life had been built on stories that weren't quite true. The man's eyes opened. For a moment, he just stared at the ceiling, confused. Then his head turned slowly, taking in the cottage, the fire, the woman in the corner with the poker in her lap. He tried to sit up. Failed. Tried again. Easy, Eleanor said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. You'll pass out again if you move too fast. He ignored her, pushed himself up on one elbow, breathing hard. His eyes found hers and held them. Blue. His eyes were blue. Not the pale blue of winter sky, but deep blue, like loch water in summer. Surprising, somehow. She'd expected something colder. Where am I? His voice was rough, scraped raw by cold and exhaustion. My grandfather's cottage. Near Loch Glencool. Do you know where that is? Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Satisfaction. Fear, maybe. Too quick to read. I got turned around in the storm, he said. I was looking for. I know what you were looking for. Eleanor stood, the poker hanging at her side. You were looking for my grandfather. For his maps. You said it in your sleep. The man's face went still. The kind of still that meant he was calculating, thinking fast, trying to figure out how much to tell. The pass is closed, Eleanor continued. I checked at first light. The snow is deeper than my waist in some places. We are trapped here until it clears. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe 3 days from now. The firewood is damp. The food is low. And I have a lord in my cottage who came here to take something from a dead man. She watched him absorb this. Watched him process the danger, the isolation, the impossibility of his situation. 3 days, he repeated. At least. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had shifted. The Lord was still there, but underneath it, something else. Something tired. My name is William Ashford, he said. Lord Ashford, if titles matter to you. They probably don't. They don't. Good. They shouldn't. He tried to sit up again, and this time made it, leaning against the wall opposite her. Your grandfather made a map. The last map he ever made. I need it. Need it or want it. Need it. Desperately. He rubbed his face with both hands. There are people who will die if that map falls into the wrong hands. Including me. Eleanor laughed. It came out sharp and bitter, surprising them both. You expect me to believe that? A lord comes to a poor woman's cottage in a storm, asks for her dead grandfather's work, and it's about saving lives? Not about money. Not about power. Lord Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He laughed too. Soft and sad, but real. "No," he said. "I don't expect you to believe it. I wouldn't believe it either." He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Your grandfather wasn't just a map maker. He was a spy. A good one. The best. He mapped things for the crown that no one else could find. Smuggling routes, hidden passes, places where men could move without being seen." The words hit Eleanor like cold water. Her grandfather? The man who'd taught her to fish, who'd read her stories by the fire, who'd cried at her grandmother's funeral. A spy? That's not possible. He was just a map maker. He lived here his whole life. He lived here his whole life because it was the perfect cover. No one suspects the old man in the remote cottage. Lord Ashford's voice was gentle now. "I'm sorry. I know this is hard to hear." Eleanor's hand tightened on the poker. "If he was working for the crown, why are you here? Why not send soldiers? Why come yourself?" "Because the crown doesn't know about this map. Only I do. And the people who want it." He paused. "Your father told me about it." The room went very quiet. "My father left 10 years ago. He never came back." "You're lying." "I wish I was." Lord Ashford met her eyes and didn't look away. "Your father came to me with debts. Gambling debts. Big ones. He said he could pay them off with a map his father had made. A map showing a route through the mountains that bypassed every checkpoint. Perfect for smugglers. Perfect for traders. Perfect for anyone who wanted to move things the crown didn't want moved." Eleanor's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the floor, the poker clattering beside her. "Your grandfather refused to give him the map. Said it was too dangerous, that it would end up in the wrong hands. Your father was angry. He said some things. About how your grandfather had ruined his life, kept him poor, never gave him anything." "Stop." "About how he was leaving and never coming back. About how you'd be better off without him." I said stop. Lord Ashford stopped. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had died to almost nothing. The kind of quiet that came after a storm had exhausted itself. Eleanor stared at her hands, at the lines and calluses, at the fingers that had held her grandfather's while he died. "My father," she said slowly, "told me the landlord ruined him. That the taxes were too high. That he was a victim. He was a gambler. A bad one. He lost everything at tables in Edinburgh and London and anywhere else that would take his money." Lord Ashford's voice was soft. "I'm sorry. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. 10 years. 10 years of believing her father was a victim, not a fool. 10 years of blaming faceless landlords and unfair taxes. 10 years of missing a man who'd chosen cards over his own daughter. The truth sat in her chest like a stone. "Why should I believe you?" she whispered. "Because I have nothing to gain by lying to you anymore. We are trapped here together. If I wanted to steal the map, I'd have searched while you slept. I didn't." He shifted, wincing as his muscles protested. "Because your grandfather was a good man, and he deserves better than to have his life's work destroyed by people who don't understand what it means." Eleanor looked at him. Really looked, past the fine clothes and the Lord's bearing, past the scar on his chin and the blue eyes that held hers. She saw someone tired. Someone scared, underneath it all. Someone who'd risked his life in a blizzard for something he believed in. "You said there are people who will die if this map is found." "Yes." "Who?" Lord Ashford hesitated. "People your grandfather protected. People who helped him. Ordinary people who live in these mountains and ask no questions and just want to live their lives. If the map falls into the wrong hands, they'll be found. Arrested. Maybe worse." Eleanor thought about the villagers she'd grown up with. The farmers who waved as they passed. The woman who ran the inn, whose husband had died in a smuggling accident years ago. Ordinary people. Good people. "Show me," she said. "Show me the map you're looking for." Lord Ashford's eyes widened. You know where it is. I know where my grandfather kept his secrets. She stood, brushing dust from her dress. But before I show you anything, you're going to tell me everything. The whole truth, this time. No more lies, no more half-stories. Everything. And if I do? Eleanor picked up the poker. Not as a weapon this time. Just something to hold, something solid in a world that kept shifting under her feet. Then we figure out what happens next. Together. The map was exactly where her grandfather had always kept his most precious things. Not hidden at all, really. Just tucked inside the cover of his Bible, pressed flat against the familiar words he'd read every Sunday of her childhood. Eleanor pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The paper was thick and yellowed, covered in lines so fine they seemed to breathe. Mountains and rivers and passes she recognized. And one line, drawn in red ink so faded it was almost pink, that she'd never seen before. Lord Ashford stood across the room, giving her space. He'd been true to his word so far, telling her everything over the past 2 hours as the fire crackled and the morning stretched toward noon. About the smugglers who wanted the route. About the Crown agents who'd pay anything to stop them. About her father, sitting in a London debtor's prison, still hoping this map would be his ticket out. That last part had hit hardest. Her father was alive. Alive and still gambling, still scheming, still trying to use other people to fix messes he'd made himself. You can come closer, Eleanor said. You've earned that much. Lord Ashford crossed the room slowly, like he was approaching something sacred. Maybe he was. Up close, she could see the way his eyes moved across the map, tracing lines, recognizing landmarks, understanding things she couldn't see. There, he said quietly, pointing to a spot near the red line. That's the pass. Your grandfather marked it perfectly. 3 days through terrain that would take anyone else a week. Hidden the whole way. He looked at her. Do you know what this means? It means my grandfather was very good at his job. It means lives can be saved. He stepped back, giving her room. If I can get this to the right people, they can block the pass. Set up watch stations. Control who comes and goes. The smugglers will have to find another way, and by the time they do, the families in these mountains will be safe. Eleanor studied his face. The way his jaw tightened when he talked about the families. The way his hands moved when he explained things, like he was drawing in the air. The way he looked at her now, waiting, hoping she'd trust him. You really care about them, she said. The ordinary people. They're not ordinary. They're just people. Same as you, same as me. They deserve to live without looking over their shoulders. He paused. Your grandfather understood that. He spent 40 years mapping these mountains, not for money, not for power, but because he believed that knowing the land meant protecting the people on it. The words settled into Eleanor like warmth. She thought about her grandfather's journals, filled with observations about weather and wildlife and the way light fell across certain valleys. She'd always thought he just loved the land. Now she understood he was loving the people on it too. He never told me, she said, any of this. He couldn't. That was the job. The only way to protect you was to keep you separate from it. Lord Ashford's voice was gentle. But he left you clues. The way he taught you to read the land, to navigate by stars, to trust your instincts. That wasn't just a grandfather teaching his granddaughter. That was a mapmaker training his successor. Eleanor looked at the map again, really looked this time. The red line wasn't just a route. It was a message. A final lesson from a man who couldn't say the words out loud. Find your own path. Trust what you know. Protect what matters. What do we do now? She asked. The storm will break by tomorrow morning. I can feel it. The pressure's changing. Lord Ashford moved to the window, peering out at the grey sky. When it does, I need to get this map to Inverness. There's a man there, a merchant named Campbell. He'll know what to do. And then I come back. He turned to face her. If you'll let me. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm and looked away, pretending to study the map. Why would you come back? Because I owe you my life. Because you trusted me when you had every reason not to. He took a step closer. Because I've spent 10 years chasing maps and secrets and things that don't matter. And in 2 days, you've shown me more about what matters than I learned in all that time. Eleanor looked up. His eyes were the same deep blue as before, but different now. Warmer. More present. You don't know me, she said. I know you saved a stranger's life. I know you chose truth over comfort. I know you're brave enough to sit with a man you had every reason to fear and listen to things you didn't want to hear. He smiled slightly. That's a pretty good start. Outside, the wind shifted. The clouds, grey all morning, began to thin at the edges, letting through pale winter light. The storm's breaking, Eleanor said. Looks like. They stood together at the window, watching the world reappear. Patches of sky. Ridges of mountains. The faint outline of the path that would take him away. Show me, Eleanor said suddenly. Show me the route. On the map. Lord Ashford looked at her, questioning. If you're going to carry my grandfather's work into danger, I want to understand where you're going. What you'll face. How long it will take. She met his eyes. I want to be part of this. Not just someone who happened to be here. He nodded slowly. Your grandfather really did teach you well. They spread the map on the table, weighing down the corners with candles and the whiskey bottle and the iron poker that had started all of this. Lord Ashford traced the red line with his finger, explaining each turn, each landmark, each hidden valley. Eleanor listened, asked questions, noted details, and slowly, piece by piece, the mountains became more than just mountains. They became a story. Her grandfather's story. Her story now. There, she said, pointing to a spot about halfway along the route. That's where you'll need to rest. There's a bothy there. My grandfather built it years ago. No one knows about it except family. Lord Ashford looked at her. You're trusting me with a lot. I'm trusting you with what matters. She held his gaze. Don't make me regret it. The afternoon passed in quiet work. Lord Ashford rested, building strength for the journey ahead. Eleanor prepared what supplies she could spare, dried meat, hard cheese, a small flask of the whiskey he hadn't finished. Small things, but they might make the difference. By evening, the sky was clear. The temperature dropped sharply, the way it always did after a storm, freezing the snow into a crust that would hold a man's weight. Tomorrow morning, Lord Ashford said. First light. Eleanor nodded. She should have felt relief. Soon she'd be alone again, safe again, free to return to her simple life in the village. Instead, she felt something else. Something she wasn't ready to name. They sat by the fire as darkness fell. The last of the candles burned low, but neither of them moved to light new ones. The flames were enough. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said. Anything. Why you? Why did you take this on? You're a lord. You could have sent anyone. Lord Ashford was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. Because I was the one who didn't listen. Years ago, your grandfather tried to warn me about something. A man I trusted. I didn't believe him. That man nearly destroyed everything my family built. He looked at the fire. Your grandfather saved us anyway. Never asked for thanks, never expected anything. Just did what was right. And now I do what he taught me. I pay attention. I listen to people who know more than I do. And when something matters, I show up myself instead of sending someone else. Eleanor thought about that. About showing up. About being present for the hard things instead of hiding from them. You showed up, she said quietly. I did. For me. Lord Ashford turned to look at her. The firelight caught his face, softening the sharp lines, making him look younger. More human. For you, he agreed. The moment stretched. Eleanor became aware of small things, the crackle of flames, the beat of her own heart, the space between them that seemed to shrink without either of them moving. "The bargain," she started. "You said it was void." "It is." "Then what happens now? Between us?" Lord Ashford reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His hand touched her cheek, warm against skin that had been cold for too long. "I don't know," he said. "But I'd like to find out." Eleanor looked at him. At the man who'd crashed through her door frozen and desperate. At the Lord who'd told her truths she didn't want to hear. At the person sitting beside her now, watching her like she was something precious. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. She closed the distance herself. The kiss was soft at first, questioning. Then deeper, warmer, full of everything they hadn't said. His hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Hers found his chest, feeling his heart beat fast and strong. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, the fire had burned low and the room was full of shadows. "The bargain is void," Eleanor whispered. "It is." "Then make a new one." Lord Ashford's smile was slow and warm. "What did you have in mind?" She thought about it. About maps and secrets and mountains. About lords and cottages and storms. About a future she'd never let herself imagine. "When you come back," she said, "we figure it out together. No bargains. No debts. Just whatever this is." "Together," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the stars had come out, sharp and bright against the winter sky. Inside, two people sat by a dying fire, holding on to something neither of them had expected to find. Morning would come soon. He would leave. The mountains would test him. But he would come back. Eleanor knew it the way she knew how to read the sky, how to find north without a compass, how to trust what mattered. Some things you just knew. And some things were worth waiting for. 3 months later, the iron poker stood in a corner of Eleanor's new room in Edinburgh, and she still hadn't decided what to do with it. It looked different here. Smaller, somehow. Less like a weapon and more like a reminder, holding up a potted fern that trailed green leaves toward the floor. The plant had been a housewarming gift from the woman downstairs, who'd taken one look at the empty room and declared it needed something alive in it. Eleanor touched one of the leaves now, soft and cool against her fingertip. March sunlight streamed through the window, warm in a way that December cold already felt like a dream. The room was small but hers. A bed in one corner, a table by the window, a chest for her clothes, and shelves she'd filled with her grandfather's journals. The map was gone now. Lord Ashford, William, had taken it to Inverness that first morning, pressing her hand one last time before disappearing into the frozen dawn. She hadn't heard from him since. At first, she'd told herself it didn't matter. She'd made it back to the village, then to Edinburgh, using the money he'd left on the table while she slept. Enough for passage, enough for a month's rent, enough to start over. She'd found work at a dressmaker's shop on the high street. Careful work that paid enough and left her evenings free. Free to think. Free to wonder. Free to watch the window and pretend she wasn't waiting. The city was nothing like the Highlands. Noise everywhere, all the time. Carts rattling over cobblestones. Vendors calling their wares. Voices and accents she was still learning to understand. The first week, she'd barely slept, the silence of the cottage replaced by sound she couldn't name or place. But she'd adapted. People always did. The dressmaker, a woman named Mrs. Graham with grey hair and sharp eyes, had taken a chance on her. "You've got good hands," she'd said that first day, watching Eleanor thread a needle. "Steady. Patient. Those can't be taught." Eleanor had smiled and said thank you and kept sewing. It felt good to work, to create something beautiful from nothing. Her grandmother had taught her that. Make something useful. Make something lovely. The world has enough of the other kind. By February, she'd saved enough for better shoes. By March, she could walk the city streets without getting lost. She'd made friends at the shop, Women who laughed easily and shared their tea and asked no questions about where she'd come from. But at night, alone in her room, she thought about the cottage, about the fire, about blue eyes and a voice that had told her truths she hadn't wanted to hear, about the kiss. She touched her lips now, standing by the window, remembering the warmth of it against the cold, remembering the way he'd looked at her after, like she was something precious instead of just a seamstress from nowhere. The letter had come 3 weeks ago. She'd recognized the seal immediately, dark wax pressed with an initial she'd seen on his signet ring. Her hands had shaken so badly she'd nearly dropped it before opening. Inside, in careful handwriting, he'd explained. The map had reached the right people. The pass was secured. The families were safe. He'd been delayed in London, dealing with matters that couldn't wait. He'd be in Edinburgh as soon as he could. And then, at the bottom, 3 words that had made her sit down hard on the bed. I'm coming back. She'd read that line 100 times since. Maybe more. It sat in her chest like a warm coal, something to hold onto when the city felt too loud or the nights too long. Today, the sunlight through the window felt different. Brighter. Warmer. Spring coming at last after a winter that had changed everything. Eleanor picked up her pen. She'd been writing to him, a letter he might never receive, telling him about her new life, about Mrs. Graham and the other seamstresses, about the way the city smelled after rain. It wasn't meant to send. It was just something to do. A way of talking to someone who wasn't there. Half a loaf of bread sat on her table, fresh from the baker that morning. She'd developed a small ritual around it, cutting a slice each evening, chewing slowly, remembering the days when half a loaf had been all that stood between her and hunger. Those days were over now. She had enough. More than enough. But she never wasted food, never took it for granted. Some lessons you carried forever. The knock at her door was soft. Hesitant. Almost. Like someone who wasn't sure they should be there. Eleanor's heart stopped. Then started again, faster. She crossed the room slowly, telling herself not to hope. It could be the woman from downstairs. Could be Mrs. Graham with more work. Could be anyone. She opened the door. William stood in the hallway, hat in his hands, looking nothing like the frozen man who'd crashed into her cottage. He was dressed simply now, dark coat, plain cravat, boots that had seen miles of walking. His face was thinner than she remembered, tired around the eyes, but his smile when he saw her was exactly the same. "Hello," he said. Eleanor couldn't speak. She just looked at him, drinking in the sight, letting herself believe he was really there. "I know I should have written again," he continued. "I know 3 months is too long. There were complications, things I couldn't control, and by the time..." She kissed him. Right there in the doorway, with the whole building probably watching, she kissed him. His hat fell to the floor. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment there was nothing but warmth and the solid feel of him against her. When they finally pulled apart, he was laughing. So was she. "I brought you something," he said, bending to retrieve his hat. From inside it, he pulled a small leather pouch. "Open it." Eleanor untied the string and tipped the contents into her palm. A key. Old iron, worn smooth with use, attached to a simple leather cord. "What is it?" "The cottage. Your grandfather's cottage. I bought it." He held up a hand before she could speak. "Before you say anything, I didn't do it for charity. I did it because it's where I found you. Where I found this. Us. I couldn't let it sit empty or fall into someone else's hands." Eleanor stared at the key, at the weight of it, warm from being close to him. "I can't accept." "You can. You will. It's yours. No bargains, no debts. Just a place that belongs to you, whenever you want it." He smiled. "I thought maybe we could go there sometime. Together. When the weather's warm. See it in daylight, without snow trying to kill us." Eleanor closed her fingers around the key, thought about the cottage, about the fire, about the window where she'd watched the snow fall and wondered if she'd survive. "I'd like that," she said quietly. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at each other. People passed in the hallway below, voices drifting up, but neither of them moved. "I should tell you," William said. "I'm not the same person who showed up at your door. That man was running from things, chasing things, never quite sure what he was looking for." He reached out, touching her cheek. "You changed that. You changed me." "You changed me too," Eleanor said. "You gave me truth when I was used to lies. You showed me my father wasn't who I thought, and somehow that made it easier to let him go. You made me brave. You were always brave. I just gave you a reason to see it." Eleanor thought about the poker, still holding up her fern. About the cottage, waiting for them in the Highlands. About all the paths her grandfather had mapped, none of them leading where she'd expected. "You should come in," she said. "I have bread. Fresh today. I'd like that. And after that, you can tell me everything. About London, about the map, about what happens next." William smiled. "What happens next is whatever we want. No more running. No more secrets. Just this." He stepped inside. Eleanor closed the door behind him, the key still warm in her hand. On the table by the window, her half-written letter sat waiting, the word she'd never needed to send. Outside, the city hummed with life, with possibility, with all the ordinary moments that added up to something extraordinary. The iron poker caught the afternoon light, holding up its green leaves like a promise. Some things ended. Some things began. And some things, the important things, just kept growing, slow and steady, reaching toward the sun. Eleanor looked at William, at the man who'd crashed into her life and changed everything. "Come find me," she'd written in her letter. He had.